What's up friends, my name is Jess. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. As you can tell by the title of this video, I'm going to be going through all of the books that I have read from January through March. I've never done any stats before and you're gonna get like the very basic stats. I'm not gonna go into the breakdown of all of these books, but in case you're curious, I read 11 books in January, I read 2 books in February. You can tell where I had the reading slump. And then I read 9 books in March, plus a bonus 2 that I'm gonna mention because I finished them on April 1st and they were continuations of series that I started. In the past, I've ordered all of my recent reads videos based on chronologically what books I finished when. Instead, I'm gonna experiment with doing this by reading order, so I'm gonna start with my lowest rated books. There are a couple exceptions of books that are lower rated, but they're a part of a series, so I'm grouping the entire series together. Alright, and let's start with what I think is the only 2-star book, A Special Place for Women by Laura Hankin. I read this book for the Full Moon Book Club that's hosted by Jan Agaton, and I was very excited about it at first. You know, this is a book that follows a journalist whose career is hanging by a thread. So in an attempt to get a big story, our journalist Gillian decides to infiltrate a female-run secret society, rumored to have been the ones behind the rise and fall of the city's first and only female mayor. And then of course, the deeper Gillian gets into the secret society, the more she realizes that the women are more dangerous and more powerful than she thought. I heard that this was a witchy book. It is, but it's also a major disappointment all around. The plot took way too many shortcuts. Gillian infiltrates this secret society way too easily. Considering they build it up as the elite of the elite, Gillian had to ask to join, essentially. And this is not a spoiler, it happens very quickly. She's also said to be an amazing writer, like a god-tier writer, and we never got to see any of her writing. All of these apparently stellar pieces of journalism were at best hinted at. Maybe we got a sentence here and there, but that was it. And as someone who studied journalism and then worked in newspapers for a little bit, that matters to me. I want to read her articles. And also, as someone who studied journalism, she was not a very respectable journalist. Her methods go against so many of the ethics that we're taught, and it doesn't even seem to be done for brave or noble reasons. So I'm left sitting here thinking that our main character is just dumb. For what reason? Why did she do any of the things that she did? The book was just predictable in every twist. The main twist of the story could have been good, except the author didn't like lean into it or go as hard with it as she could have. So the plot twist ended up feeling shallow, which is exactly how I would describe this book in one word. The plot twist was bare bones, minimum thought put into it. The characters are all one-dimensional. This book promises some great commentary on feminism, and at first I was hopeful. I genuinely thought this book was being satirical and poking fun at white feminism, but no. Maybe it tried to do something more than that, but it was the epitome of shallow white feminism in the end. Whatever commentary is attempted just isn't followed through and is basically made obsolete by the ending. It's a very pretty cover. I wish I had liked it so that I could have it on my shelves, but no, 2 stars. Next up we have Ring by Koji Suzuki. I gave this book 3 stars. This is the book that the horror movie is based off of, and so if you've never seen the movie and you don't know anything about it, we're following a journalist whose niece has died from unknown causes, and so have 3 other teenagers. Our main character starts digging into their last moves to try and figure out how and why these teenagers died, and along the way he discovers a videotape that warns viewers that they will die in a week unless they do some unspecified thing. This book is on my top 22 books that I want to read in 2022. I was so extremely disappointed by this. It doesn't live up to my memories of the movie, and in all fairness, I think a lot of the issues could be attributed to the translation. I don't think the translation was very good. It made the writing style feel very boring and used passive voice a lot, so even if the plot and the characters were all stellar, I think it still would have been kind of a drag to get through. I didn't necessarily dock stars for that. What I did dock stars for were fundamental parts of the plot that just shouldn't have been in it. There are some things in this book that are treated as titillating when they shouldn't have been, and this next thing that I'm about to say is a mild spoiler, but I think it's really important for people to know going in so that you can decide if this is something you want to put up with. But you know, why is the main character's best friend a rapist? This isn't a plot twist, by the way. This is just something the main character has known since they were both in high school, and the guy told him. The book tries to redeem this guy in the end, but regardless of whatever redemption they try to give him, the main character spent this entire book thinking that this man has been raping women. Like, I don't know about y'all, but that's not friend material to me, and so I really couldn't get past that. Unfortunately, I did get past that, and the next next thing that I'm going to mention is more of a spoiler. It's one of the main twists, I guess you could say, about the antagonist of the story. But again, I think it's kind of important to know. If you don't want to know, skip to said time. But apparently, a major plot twist is that the antagonist is intersex. That is her greatest shame, apparently. And I apologize if this doesn't actually fit into the medical definition of what intersex is. This is just my understanding of what she would be considered. But basically, the main antagonist has a fully female body, except she also has testicles. So why on earth is the plot twist about the ghost's genitals? I don't understand that. It's basically just for shock value, and introduces some transphobic thoughts as well. So it was wildly inappropriate for today's age, and I also can't imagine this was inappropriate for the age in which it came out. Overall, the book was kind of like meh, kind of bland. I'll admit I did feel uneasy as I was reading it, like I got kind of on edge, but I honestly don't know if it's because of the book or if it's because I'm just remembering what the movie was like, because the antagonist in that movie has quite the look to her. You don't easily forget those scenes. Regardless, I couldn't look past those two things. The plot was generally too convenient. And while we're here, I would not even bother reading the sequels. I can understand the argument for wanting to read this book, but don't read the sequels. Just read the Wikipedia summaries, which is what I did. It seems like all of the books after this get so much more convoluted, and it's just a way to continue the series and make money off of it. Next, we've got Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I'm sure a lot of you already know what the plot of this story is, but basically it follows a married couple, Nick and Amy, and on the day of their wedding anniversary, Amy goes missing. As investigations into her disappearance are underway, more and more evidence is piling up to show that Nick might know more than he's letting on. So the question is he or is he not a killer? The main impression that I have been left with from this book is that not a single character likes women. I'll admit that the plot twist of Gone Girl is good. I think it holds up. This was a reread of the book, so I already knew what was going to happen, and it was still entertaining seeing the plot twist happen and then having that switch in the story once you know what's going on. But that's the one thing that I can say about it. The characters are all annoying and they're all misogynistic in their own ways. Amy is basically the blueprint for the pick-me girl. The first half of the story dragged on, was plain boring. The second half was more entertaining because we finally had the truth of what was going on and we were just waiting to see how it would play out. But I didn't like any of the characters. The main characters were both spoiled and self-centered and toxic all around, which I get was intentional, but they were unsympathetic through and through and they deserved every single thing that happened to them. I did not like being in the perspective of any of them. I can't remember if I've seen the movie before. Whether I have or not, just watch the movie. I recommend watching the movie instead. Okay, next. Survive the Night by Riley Sager. In this book, our main character Charlie's friend has recently been murdered by a serial killer that's been plaguing their campus. Attempting to run away from her grief, Charlie hitches a ride with somebody off of the college ride board, but as they spend hours in this car together, Charlie comes to realize that she might be sharing the car with the killer himself. Now, after reading this and Home Before Dark, which I think I maybe read last year, I'm not sure, but after those two books, I think I've decided that Riley Sager just isn't for me. They're fun, quick reads, but there's not much depth to them, and they just don't stick with me. They're the kind of books that I would read when I want to fill my time and read something, but I don't want to put any kind of mental or emotional effort, which I'm saving up for the books that I actually truly want to read. But hey, there's nothing wrong with a filler. We all need filler books sometimes, so if that's what you're looking for, Survive the Night is maybe the thing for you. There is a movie angle to this story, which I thought was interesting. Our main character, Charlie, is obsessed with films. She tends to see the world and the people around her through the perspective of movies and films, and she also occasionally has delusions that are modeled after old school films. I thought it was interesting. I like when people try to frame their narratives in different ways, and I really, really love unreliable narrators. I like not being sure if I'm being told the truth or not. That being said, I wasn't a huge fan of our main character. She was pretty one-dimensional, but I guess you could excuse that by saying that she was grieving a lot, and so there wasn't a lot of room for her to be anything but grieving. Even so, she makes some questionable decisions. For somebody who's watched a lot of movies, she must have not watched any horror movies. My biggest gripes with the book all have to do with the ending. I guess the plot twist way before it happened, so it was kind of anticlimactic when it came around, and I absolutely loathed the epilogue. I won't say anything about it, but I will say that I strongly disagree, and I hate when that trope happens. is. Next, we've got The Moonlight Child by Karen McQuestion. The events of the book start when an innocent old lady and her new lodger notice some suspicious activity happening at the neighbor's house. A little girl is seen washing dishes late at night, but the neighbors don't have a daughter. And even if they did, why would she be doing chores at like 11 p.m.? This is classed as a mystery thriller. It is not. Do not go into this expecting that, or else you will be disappointed. You know what the situation is a couple chapters in. There's no thrill. There's no urgency to this story. Except for like a couple chapters at the end, but in general, no. However, if you go into this book looking for characters and relationships, you might enjoy this a lot more. I love seeing the interactions between the old lady Sharon and her new tenant, Nikki, and between some of the other characters as well. I thought it was really touching. I thought it was emotional. I think it's great representation of people building their own families and welcoming people into their lives. I think this book also says something about not standing by and doing nothing and actually helping when you see something is wrong. This is a multiple POV story, and I did like going into the heads of all of our different characters. Each point of view had a very distinct voice. My personal favorite was being in the POV of our antagonist. It was a well done look into just how warped their perspective of everything was, so I thought that was fun. Even so, it's a slow going book. Most of the action happens in the last few chapters, and there wasn't a huge impact to it. There is essentially no plot twists here. So the next three books I'm not going to talk about a lot because they're mentioned in a different video. The first one is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This book attempts to answer the question of what happens to final girls once the credits starts rolling. You know, all of those girls who make it to the very end of horror movies, who survive massacres and serial killers and all sorts of things. What happens to them? Apparently, they all join a support group, but in this book, all of their lives are thrown into turmoil again because it turns out somebody is looking to finish what was started and kill all of the final girls. Again, I'm not going to say much. If you want to get my full thoughts on this book, watch my Grady Hendrix taste test video where I go into it. I vlog my experience reading it. But basically, it was very entertaining to read. I read it in like 2 days, I think. It's action-packed. I thought it was interesting being in the narrator's head because she is so clearly unreliable and mentally unstable. She has a very extreme case of paranoia. This book is especially great for people who love slasher movies because there are some nods to some classics that you might find. But that being said, it was very predictable by the end, and it was much longer than I would have wanted. The next one is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, also by Grady Hendrix, although this one got a 4 stars. This book is set in an 80s suburban neighborhood where a group of women have put together a book club to read about serial killers and murders. But things are about to get very real when they realize that children are starting to go missing, weird things are happening around the neighborhood, and there may be an actual literal vampire down the road. Again, watch the taste test video for my full thoughts on this. This and the next book that I'm going to talk about get very similar critiques. All I will say here is that I did enjoy this book, but it was slow to get into. It felt like the action was kind of stilted in its pacing. What Hendrix does very well, though, is setting a scene. And he also seems to settle into his character's headspace really well. And commentary. I think he does commentary well. This book is more focused on the toxicity of maintaining one's image in a society, and also some comments on how different communities are more privileged than others. We had some comedic moments that I liked. I wish that the ending was more gory and horrific. So in general, this was an entertaining story, but it feels like a tame horror novel. And the final book that I read for the Grady Hendrix taste test video was My Best Friend's Exorcism, also 4 stars. In this book, our main character thinks that her best friend has been possessed by a demon. That's it. That's the story. They're childhood best friends. They're in high school now. The best friend's acting a little weird. I had a bit of a hard time getting into this book at first. The beginning of the story felt messy and disjointed. There were things thrown in that I think just weren't necessary, but I ultimately ended up really liking it. Were it not for the first 30% of the book, I feel like I maybe would have considered giving this 5 stars. Once I got into it, I really started loving the writing style. It reminds me a lot of like 2000s horror, like comedy horror maybe. We've got some themes of friendship. We've got commentary on sexual assault that I thought was pretty well done. I do have to give some warnings for eating disorders, rape, victim blaming, attempted suicide, and torture, I believe. This is the first time I've read body horror that has actually made me have a physical reaction. And you know what? I respect that. I like a horror book that will actually get me to feel something. The next book is The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. I read this book for the Winers Book Club. I will link their Twitter down below if you're interested in seeing their reads, watching their live shows, you know. Following a fraud scandal at his company, our main character's husband runs away. totally disappears, leaving behind only a note that instructs her to protect her stepdaughter. The last thing he told me follows along as our main character and her stepdaughter try to piece together what happened, why he ran away, and where he went. This is another book that's listed as a mystery thriller, and I think it does the book no favors at all. I didn't find it very thrilling. I'll give that it's a mystery, but it's not fast-paced in my opinion. There were no heart-racing moments. It was interesting to see the characters get some answers to their questions, but all of the answers were pretty cliched. I easily guessed it long before the characters got there. The best thing about this book, however, is the character development. As individuals, I don't think that the main character and the stepdaughter really developed much. There was some, but most of their development is focused on the relationship between the two of them, and I thought it was pretty nice. I thought it was touching. I do think the ending will upset a lot of people, but personally I think the ending was fitting. I appreciate authors who make their endings realistic, even if it isn't, you know, a happy ending or necessarily always a satisfying ending, because that's just life sometimes. Sometimes the ending to a story isn't what you want. But overall, fun read, didn't leave an impact, and honestly, now that I have finished talking about it, I feel like this probably should have gotten a 3 stars instead of a 4 stars. But I had fun at a 4-star level, so. Next up we've got what I think is the only nonfiction on the list, which is Hood Feminism by Nikki, Kendall. This is an essay collection centered around intersectional feminism, specifically talking about how all social issues are feminist issues, including topics like food insecurity and access to quality education. I think this is a very good beginner feminist text. The language is super accessible, and it doesn't assume the reader's level of knowledge or education in regards to feminism. It's perhaps one step above beginner because it goes a bit deeper than just mainstream feminism. While I knew the basics of a lot of what was mentioned in here, I did not have the info to back it up. This book made me think of certain things from a new perspective and consider things that I agreed with, but I just had never thought about before. I had never considered it before. I honestly wish I could memorize this book because it would be so helpful in articulating my thoughts and arguing them to my less than ideal relatives. That being said, I think the book could be more clear and concise. It just felt like it lost the plot often. Each chapter has a new topic and a new point being made, and sometimes the author followed trains of thought that veered far from the original point. It just made it confusing sometimes to keep track of what the chapter was originally talking about and what the original point was. Next is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. This book follows 2 generations starting with a pair of identical twins. The twins are black, raised in a black community, but are very white passing. Their stories diverge in adulthood when one sister decides to return to her hometown to raise her black daughter, and the other sister decides to live as a white woman and marry a white man who has no idea of her background. Years later, their daughters run into each other. I'll be honest, I feel like I'm not smart enough to fully express my thoughts about this book. The discussions being had here are complex. We're looking at race, identity, motherhood, how all of those things interact with each other and influence each other. And as a discussion, the book is really interesting. It's interesting to contemplate this scenario and consider how circumstances shape a person and what those circumstances and your subsequent actions say about you. From just the synopsis, I was tempted to think that this would be a black and white situation. You know, obviously the one sister shouldn't be pretending that she's something she's not. But after reading this, I don't think it was the right decision for her morally or emotionally, but I understand why. And who am I to judge the difficult choices that she and everyone else in this book made? I would call this book a character study. It spans across decades, so we get to see our characters grow and intersect. There's a lot of development in here. If you like things like that, then try this book. But don't expect a very exciting or action-packed book, which is where I think my disappointment came in, because I was expecting The Vanishing Half to be much faster paced than it was. It wasn't as gripping as I was hoping for. Even the moments that should have been adrenaline-inducing, action-packed, turning points of the story just weren't. Everything came very slowly, and that's not something that I necessarily hate or that I think it shouldn't have done. It just wasn't what I was looking for. I also felt a little unsatisfied with the ending, which I understand is a little hypocritical to say after I just said that the ending of the last thing he told me emulated what life is like. I respect endings that are open-ended, but that doesn't mean I always like them, and in this case, I feel like we could have gotten something more than that. I didn't get the resolutions I wanted, I didn't get the climactic scenes that I wanted, and again, perhaps that was my fault for thinking that this book was something other than what it intended to be. I am running out of breath, y'all. All right, next we've got Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This is a very short story in verse. The whole book takes place over the course of 60 seconds. Our main character is taking the most important elevator ride of his life, because at the end of the trip he has to decide if he's going to avenge his brother's death or not. Because books in verse use so much less words, I always expect authors to be very intentional with their word choice. I expect them to pack the biggest punch possible in as little words possible. And oftentimes I'm kind of disappointed. It often feels like a regular prose book that hasn't been fleshed out and just has random line separations. That is not at all the case. That is not at all the case with this one, though. Reynolds had a purpose for every single word that he chose, and he made the most of the space that he had in this book. His language does have an emotional impact, and there were some lines that just took my breath away when I read them, and I literally had to reread them to fully process what they were saying to me. However, this does have a problem that a lot of books in verse have for me. I was left wanting more. Not with the ending, which I recognize could upset/disappoint a lot of people. I thought the ending was exactly what was needed, considering this book is all about self-reflection. I was left wanting more in the middle, though, and I can't quite explain it. I just feel like everything happens so fast. That's on me. I know that books in verse often don't work for me, and that's something that I just need to keep in mind when I go into something. I can't really judge them fairly. This is definitely a book worth reading, though. It's worth every single minute, especially because it doesn't take very many minutes at all to read it. I love the discussion here about how people are the way they are and do the things they do for a reason. And you can't really judge them because there are so many factors that have led them to this present day. And I really like that the story isn't framed in terms of right versus wrong. Like, life is so much more complicated than that, and this book is clear about that. Next, we've got The Weight of Our Sky by Hanna Alkaf. This book takes place during the 1969 race riots in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Our main character, Melati, gets separated from her mother on the day of the riots. And amidst death and violence, Melati attempts to find her mother, all whilst battling a jinn inside of her. This jinn being Melati's OCD, which manifests in her head as a dangerous jinn who threatens the life of her mother unless she adheres to his rules and rituals. So I don't give half stars, and every day I question that decision more and more because I feel like maybe this book is more so a 3.5 stars than it is a 4 stars, but I think it says a lot that I gave it 4 stars. And I think it's deserving of 4 stars objectively, even if subjectively it maybe felt more like a 3.5. I read this book because I was feeling sad at that time. Why? Depression, of course. And I wanted a book that was going to make me feel even more sad. The vibes of this book are miserable. And if you want to wallow in misery, this is a good choice for you. However, I wanted to cry to get all of my feelings out, and this book didn't make me cry, so you know. But obviously this isn't going to be a happy book because it's taking place in the context of several days worth of fatal riots. I had no historical context for this story besides what the author told me, and I think there was an introductory note, I'm not sure. But I think the book does a good job of explaining everything that you need to know about the situation. It doesn't detail all of the political turmoil or all of the complexities of the situation, but that makes sense because what teenager would know the complexities? We know as much as Melati does. And that's enough for the story. Because the point of this book, in my opinion, is more so about remembering the people lost and remembering that at the end of the day, we're all humans. Everyone has their own side to the story, and we should try to be kind instead of attacking each other for the differences. This book very simply shows the good and the bad of people. What made me the saddest, though, and the reason why I ended up giving this book 4 stars instead of 3 stars, was Melati's OCD. I don't have OCD, so I don't have a personal perspective on it. I can't speak on it on a representation standpoint, but I thought it was really well done. The personification of her OCD as a djinn did wonders for my understanding of how OCD works. That djinn was constant. Not a page went by without it being mentioned and without it whispering insidious things to Melati and grasping at her throat and clenching around her stomach, all natural physical feelings to anxiety and distress that were attributed to this monster that just never left her alone. I felt anxious. I felt like I was being harassed. I felt like this djinn would not leave me alone. I feel like I left this book with a better understanding and more sympathy for people who struggle with OCD. Fake spoiler though, there was a moment of worry where it seemed like our main character was going to miraculously be cured of OCD, which I would not have been happy about because mental health did not work that way. But that was not the case, and it's made very clear that something like OCD doesn't just go away. That being said, Melati does have real growth here. She works hard to work around her OCD in order to do what has to be done, and I applaud her for that. I admired her dedication. The other characters, besides one maybe, had minimal growth, if any at all, but I appreciated all of them. You know, the author attempted to show different kinds of people and get you to understand their motives and why they do the things that they do. As a warning, there is a very minor romance thread. You could try to dismiss it as a friendship. I don't think it is, but regardless, it doesn't overwhelm the story. It does not feel out of place, and despite that, it is not a romance book. You cannot confuse this with a romance book. Overall, I'm glad that I read this book, mostly because of what I feel like I learned about OCD and the historical events behind it, but the plot really won't stick with me. I wish that this book had more of an impact. I understand the author was going for a hopeful tone, which fair enough, but I feel like it also meant that it didn't hit as hard as it could have. Next, Wilder Girls by Rory Powers. Alright, this book centers around a girls' boarding school that has been under quarantine for over a year. An unknown disease has ravaged the school, killing people and causing mutations. But when our main character's best friend goes missing, it looks like it's time to break quarantine and go find her. I loved this book. Honestly, I was tempted to give it 5 stars, but I was nitpicking here, and I feel like 4 stars was probably objectively more accurate. The body horror aspect of all of the mutations didn't really horrify me or disturb me, but I was intrigued to see the different ways that the tox, which is the disease, manifested in people. The book was slow to get to the action. There was a lot of build-up, and then it felt like everything happened all at once, which kind of resulted in an ending with a lot of loose ties. If this turns out to be a series, then fine. I'm okay with the ending. I would expect those things to be answered in the next book, but it's been many years, no announcement of a sequel of any kind. I don't think there's one coming, which makes me less okay with it. But whatever, we're gonna talk about the things that I liked. I like that we slowly peel back the layers of these characters. Not as deeply as I wish we would, which again begs the question of a sequel, because I have some questions about Wyatt's personality specifically that I want answered. So much of this hinges on a sequel that I know is probably not gonna happen. One of the biggest flaws with this book, I think, is the marketing of it. I think a lot of people go into it expecting an epic sapphic romance, but that doesn't happen. There is a sapphic romance, but it is so minor that you could probably entirely ignore it and it would not affect the plot at all. On the one hand, I love that it's not the main focus because they have bigger fish to fry, but on the other hand, it's not a focus at all, which means it's underdeveloped and the potential was nipped in the bud far too soon. But still, what can I say? I loved the book. I loved the writing style, I loved the descriptions. We got a bit of flowery prose, which I love when I feel like it's done right. I just thought that the concept was so interesting, and I like that Powers didn't shy away from making these girls ugly and grotesque. Again, I would think less of it if it isn't a series, you know? Whew. Alright, we have gotten to the first physical book that I'm gonna hold up. Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. I'm not gonna hold this up for long. So this is kind of an alternate history type of story where clairvoyance became a known thing and a crime 200 years before this story begins. Our main character, Paige, is a rare dream walker, capable of affecting people's spirits and a boon to her criminal gang. One day, however, she's kidnapped and taken to Oxford, a secret city controlled by a powerful and otherworldly species. There, she and other clairvoyants are enslaved and trained. This book was way too info dumpy in the beginning. It was hard to get into at first because it felt like so much information was parsed out in huge chunks and less than entertaining chunks at that. I mean, fair enough, this is a detailed system. We have a hierarchy of clairvoyance, and it's interesting to see how different powers manifest and how they work. The antagonist species mentioned in the synopsis is vaguely frightening, like I'm sure it would be horrifying to see in person. Ultimately, the concepts in this book felt more interesting than the characters or the plot itself. But it was entertaining once I got into it. I felt a need to keep reading and find out what was going to happen next. I liked meeting the different characters. I very much wanted them to break free. There was a lack of character development, but there was also a lot that had to be established in this world. So I'm willing to forgive that because this is such a long series. There's room for more character development. The only other thing I will say is that that romance subplot should not have happened, and I hope it's not super present in future books. I did finish the second book to this series, The Mime Order, on April 1st, so that's the first of the bonus books that I'm going to mention. I ended up giving that one 3 stars instead of 4 stars like the Bone Season got. Honestly, I don't know if these books are as long as they feel, but they feel like really long books. I started getting burnt out with this world in the middle of the Mime order, so maybe that affects how I see it, but it just felt so much longer than it needed to be. We spent the whole book working towards an event that I expected to see in the middle of the story, which meant that it ultimately felt anticlimactic. It was definitely cool to see how Paige's powers grow in the second one, but besides that bit of growth in that one event, it felt like we had very little movement forward. I read like 500 to 600 pages, and I feel like I got maybe 300 pages worth of content. Did end on a cliffhanger though. I want to know how things work out, because the corruption and the political scheming in this book got like a whole lot more complex. So I will continue the series, but I need a break. I need a break from him. Hey, what's up? It's Editing Jess cutting in here because I could not keep editing. I could not edit this video the way I originally intended to. I intended to do all of the books that I read January through March, but it's too many books to try to force y'all to go through it in one video. So I'm cutting it off here, and next week you'll get all of my 5-star reads in a separate video. And rest assured, I have decided that this is probably going to be my last recent reads video. I think I'm going to go back to doing monthly wrap-ups instead, because I just, in general, read too many books in the span of 3 months to try to shove it into one video. It's painful for me, it's probably painful for you. If you have any opinions on that change or any opinions on the books that I've already talked about, you know the spiel, comment below. And do make sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so that you do get notified when part 2 to this recent reads goes up. I will see you in the next one.